Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I selected some interesting and critical moments from some of the games of Bobby Fischer. Here is the first example that I'd like to share with you. This position was reached in the famous game between Paul Keres and Bobby Fischer. Well, what's important about this position is that while white has two extra pawns, the white king has lost the right to castle and is in a very cramped position in need to defend the bishop on e2. An experienced eye can sense that black has serious compensation, if not more. However, between having that sense and actually materializing your initiative to material gain or checkmate to decide the game to your favor requires a lot of accuracy. And in this particular case, Bobby Fischer made a mistake that allowed his opponent to escape and save the game. Fischer, in the actual game, captured the pawn on a2, which was a mistake, allowing white to play simply bishop to f3, followed by king g2, and more or less get back in business and have an at least equal position for white. In the game, instead, white made a major mistake by blundering with bishop to b5, attacking black's rook. This move was a mistake because it puts the bishop on an unprotected square along with white already having another piece on an unprotected square. And because of the combination of these two pieces positioned unfortunately as they are, now black can make a simple fork with queen d5, attacking white's rook and bishop. And then after bishop took the rook, black captured white's rook with a check, followed by capturing white's bishop with another check. And then after king d3, black successfully protected both the queen and the bishop, which are hanging at the moment, by playing bishop e1 when white resigned. Despite this quick victory that Fischer achieved, it became clear that queen took a2 was a mistake, allowing white to save the game with bishop f3. So the question is, objectively speaking, and considering the fact that we always should be ready for our opponent's best move and not gamble and hope that they'll make a wrong move or a blunder. So considering that, we should be trying to find the objectively correct move that actually would have given black a win no matter how white replies. And I suggest you take a little bit of time and try to analyze the position yourself and come to the conclusion of what black's best choice is in this position to actually win the game. The missed move was a move that looks rather harmless, but in all reality, it would have been a very dangerous move. And that is bishop to d2. But what does this move even threaten with? Well, to demonstrate to you what the threat is, let me make kind of a random move for white, like a4, trying to advance the passed pawn on the a file. Now, what black would do is chase the white queen away from white's bishop on e2. White can only temporarily continue protecting the bishop with the queen with queen f3, and here comes the reason behind black's sneaky move bishop d2 to clear the c3 square for the black rook now to attack the white queen. And then, when the white queen indeed is forced to leave the protection of the bishop on e2, then black is ready for a pretty combination with rook takes bishop, which of course cannot be captured because of an immediate checkmate. So let's go back to the starting position where black should have played bishop d2, threatening to then play h5, chasing away the white queen, and then capture the bishop on e2. If white right now would move away the bishop to b5, attacking the black rook, black would respond in a similar manner, attacking the white queen immediately by playing h5. If queen f3, rook c3 again, and if the queen goes elsewhere, it's even worse because the rook would be hanging on d1. And finally, after bishop to d2, if white plays bishop f3, putting the bishop in a safe-looking square, black would still play h5, chasing the queen further away from the defense of the king's side. After queen d7, black has a beautiful move, bishop to e3, threatening with an immediate checkmate, obviously, and if white accepts the sacrifice, rook captures on e3, giving black the winning advantage when the best choice for white would be to now give up the queen for the rook on c8, but that of course would give a very significant advantage for black. So the moral of the story is, before you give up your initiative, like in this position with queen takes pawn and then allowing bishop f3 followed by king g2, be in search for something more ambitious in order to trying to not to get your opponent off the hook and continue follow up with your attack. Obviously, queen a2 is a move to recapture a pawn and try to equalize the game. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. Well, this is a pretty crazy looking position, as we can tell. Bobby Fischer, who played black also in this game against Grandmaster Pachman, has sacrificed a piece earlier, and the second piece, his knight on c6, is in jeopardy. At the same time, it's quite clear that the white king is in a lot of danger, being on e1, about to be checked possibly from g1 or with the rook from h1. Nevertheless, as we said, white has a significant material advantage, and if the white king succeeds to escape, eventually white will be able to convert to a win his material plus. The game continued with Bobby Fischer making a mistake and giving the very natural check with the queen on g1. Now, if white continues with a natural looking bishop blocking on f1, white indeed would lose right away at that to the elegant queen sacrifice with queen takes bishop, as king takes queen results checkmate immediately with rook h1. The problem was that after queen g1 check, white simply moved the king to d2 instead, allowing queen takes pawn on f2, and then the king ran away on c3. If now black continues with another check on e3, white can comfortably block that with the rook or the queen on d3. The game continued with queen to g3, making a discovered attack on the white queen, which simply moved away to d3, and then black's attack pretty much ran out of steam and white won. So let's go back to this critical moment and try to figure out how could black still maintain his attack and in fact develop it to a win. In this case, black should have captured the pawn on d5. At that time, white cannot be greedy and capture the knight on c6, because then already queen g1 would follow, and after king d2, queen takes f2, and if king c3, queen takes b2 with a check, king d3 followed by f2, giving black a winning position. If instead, after pawn takes d5, white recaptures, then black would simply bring the knight to e7. And only after bringing the knight to f5, black would continue with queen g1 later, and the attack would prevail. For example, bishop c4 would be answered with b5, and if d6, pawn takes bishop, queen takes, and now knight d5, amazingly giving up the knight, and if queen takes, king h8, resulting with a winning attack for black. Let's move on to another example from one of Fischer's games. This position has been reached in a game between Paul Benko against Bobby Fischer in the 1959 Candidates Tournament. White has a clearly superior position despite black having 2 extra pawns at the moment. The reason for that is that the black king is in a very vulnerable position, and in addition, white is immediately threatening to capture 2 of black's pawns. In addition, the black rook on a5 is completely out of place. Fischer tried the best he could and played e5, trying to save his key pawn on e7. And this was a crucial moment. Obviously, white has the option to do en passant, which in fact white played. However, that certainly improved black's chances to survive. The correct move here was to capture the pawn on h4, not allowing the black king to escape through f7 because of the skewer coming through rook h7. If black now would play rook h8, white would trade rooks, followed by queen h6 check, and then queen f6, winning all the pawns back, followed by bringing the rook to e3 and g3, and black would lose further material. After e5 and rook takes h4, if black would respond with king g8, then white's answer would be bringing the rook through the f-file, rook f1, followed by rook to f3, for example, rook a1 check, king h2, and if f4 preventing rook g3, then rook g4, king f7, and now white can use a tactic by taking and then taking and capturing the rook on f8. Going back to the starting position of this endgame, after e5, white mistakenly captured the wrong pawn, even though still maintaining the advantage. The reason why this was a mistake, because it allowed to reactivate black's rook on a5, which was so out of play and far away from defending the black king. The game continued with rook g5, and now rook takes h4 and queen c5 check. It's quite clear that in this position, white still has the upper hand, having a dangerous pass pawn on e6, and also the black king being in a more sensitive position than white's. However, Benko here, I guess, underestimated his chances and responded by playing queen f2, allowing black to exchange queens. And as we know, when you're attacking, that's the last thing you want to do, to exchange queens. While Bobby Fischer did not trade the queens right away, but played rook to e5, the white queen no longer has a way out of that exchange. After rook g4, king h6, queen traded on c5, rook e1, king f2, pawn took, king took rook, and rook e8. Eventually the game ended in a draw. There was, though, one more moment after e5, white did en passant, which was an error, rook g5, rook takes pawn, queen c5, where white still could have maintained significant advantage by playing rook e3. I understand that it's not very tempting to move into a pin, and it's certainly an exception from the rule that in this case white is able to, and in fact should have, played this move. Here, after rook e5, the correct move would be to give a check, force the black king to the h-file, and then unpin the rook by playing rook d4, and white would still have decent winning chances, threatening with rook h3 and such on the next move. So what's the moral of the story in this position? It is that try to keep your opponent's pieces away from that defending their king or out of play. That was the main error here, that by capturing the pawn with en passant after e5, all of a sudden black's rook, which is totally cut out of play, totally cut away from the king's side, all of a sudden became an active participant and an active defender of black's king, and in fact attacker of white's king. So by practicing, by analyzing such critical moments in games, you'll gain better understanding and a better sense on what's important or what's supposed to be a priority over various important things. And let's see one last example in this lesson from Bobby Fischer's practice when a critical moment was mishandled. Here we go. In this position, Bobby Fischer had the white pieces against Pachmann. Here black has to make a big decision. Whether go purely on the defense of the g7 pawn, which obviously white is attacking with both the queen and the rook, or rather try to look for counterplay by playing rook d1 check. Again, try to take your time and try to analyze the position, preferably without moving the pieces around. If you're not feeling to come to a right conclusion, try to move the pieces and come to the right conclusion of what should black do here. Should you decide on protecting your pawn with rook g8, or should you rather play actively? Pachmann chose the passive way, the defensive way, and played rook g8. He very soon regretted that, as came queen g6, when already he was forced to play really passively and play king f8. Instead, he blundered and played king e7, when white had a very nice simplification combination to reach a winning pawn endgame. Came queen g7, followed by the trade of all the major pieces, and then white is able to create passed pawns on both sides of the board between playing g5 and then eventually c5 and creating two passed pawns on the b and h files, and the black king cannot catch both of them. In this position, black resigned. Instead, in this position, black should have given the check and then captured a pawn on f4, which would have resulted in pinning the white rook. So therefore, the white queen would have been alone in trying to attack the black king, and that would not be sufficient, and actually white could not really make progress here. For example, if now would come c5, creating a passed pawn on the b file, black would answer with rook d5, threatening with rook g5, and b7, and rook d8, and again white cannot make progress to win the game. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go with the final position of this lesson. It's white to move, and quite amazingly, despite black being ahead at the moment, white can not only draw but even win the game. Of course, white could capture either the black knight or the black bishop on g6 right away, but that would only lead to a draw. White's hope is, in fact, in his only pawn, the passed pawn on c6. Well, the first move c7, of course, is a very natural one, and in fact, at first it seems that black is already lost because the pawn is unstoppable. So the first task is to figure out a defensive idea for black. How can black try to catch that pawn? Obviously, bishop f5 doesn't do anything because white could just capture the bishop. Here is black's idea. Forcing the white king with two well-placed checks into a forking position after king takes, and now d5. Now we got the idea. If white promotes the pawn to a queen, black is ready to give a fork with knight d6 check. However, white can force an amazing checkmate in just 4 moves from here. Namely, knight check, a second knight check, and now under promotion to another knight, and here, amazing dance of knights and checkmate. I hope you enjoyed this extremely beautiful puzzle, and of course, learn from the experience of Bobby Fischer some of the missed moments from his games. Try to go and look back at them and learn from them, and try to not to make the same mistakes. Thank you for listening. So long until next week.